He took 40 bullets. If he dies, Washington will know your name.
Then stop threatening me and put him on my table.
Incoming trauma, 4 minutes out.
Light up the trauma bay. We have 4 minutes. Addison, you are not cleared to operate. If we wait for permission, he dies.
Don't let me die.
You're not dying on my table.
You saved him.
I only did what no one else would.
40 bullets. That's what I would pull out of a man whose name I was never allowed to know. But that was still 40 minutes away. Right now, I only knew this. The on-call surgeon was stuck behind a 5-car pileup on 610, and I was the only one standing in a trauma bay with a dying stranger between me and an empty operating table. Something in my hands already recognized the shape of what was coming before my mind caught up to it. A kind of readiness I hadn't let myself think about in years. One I'd learned somewhere far from this hospital, long before Crestline Regional ever gave me a badge. The night had started slow. Too slow. I'd been doing this long enough to know that a quiet Tuesday at Crestline Regional was never really quiet. It was just holding its breath. The monitors kept their steady rhythm. The overhead lights buzzed the way they always did. And somewhere under the hum of it all, I caught the smell of antiseptic that never really leaves your clothes, no matter how many times you wash them. I'd learned to read that silence years ago. It always broke. It broke at 11:42, when the radio crackled with a code I didn't like the sound of. Unidentified male, critical trauma, 4 minutes out. I moved before I finished thinking, because that's what 12 years in this unit does to you. It stops asking your permission. I called for the trauma bay to be lit up. Carts rolled into position. Sterile trays laid out like we were expecting a war. We were. What came through those doors wasn't an ambulance. It was a blacked-out government SUV that didn't so much park as detonate into the bay, and out of it came 2 men who were not paramedics. No gurney, no radio handoff. Just a heavy, limp body slung between their arms, soaked through in a way that told me his blood had been leaving him for longer than anyone wanted to admit. We need a surgeon. Now. The taller one didn't ask. He barked it like an order he expected obeyed. I was already moving toward the man on their arms, my hands finding his wrist out of instinct before I even had his name, which, I would learn, I was never going to get. His pulse fluttered under my fingers, thin and uneven, the kind of pulse that tells you a body is deciding something. What happened to him? I asked, cataloging what I could see. Built like he trained for exactly this kind of night. Wounds that weren't grazes, weren't warnings. His body looked like something had gone through it and meant to. Ambush, the soldier said, jaw tight. He took over 40 rounds. He's our asset. He lives, or you answer to Washington. I didn't have time to ask what that meant, and some part of me didn't want to know. I looked around the bay. The charge nurse's eyes were wide, waiting on someone, anyone, to say what came next. Because the person who was supposed to say it was somewhere on 610 with his hazards on, still a good 20 minutes out even if traffic broke free right now. Nobody moved. They were all looking at me. Prep for field surgery, I said, and I heard my own voice come out sharper than I expected. The kind of sharp that doesn't leave room for a second opinion. Suction, clamps, irrigation. I'm going in. Addison. The charge nurse said my name like a warning. You are not cleared for this? I don't care, I said, and I meant it in a way that scared me a little, even then. If we wait for cleared, he dies on this table. There was a beat where the whole room hung in the balance, and then it broke the other way. Gloves snapped on. Carts rolled forward. Somebody flipped the overhead lights to full, and the man was lifted onto the table like he weighed nothing, though I could tell by the way 3 of us struggled with him that he didn't. I cut through his gear first, layers of tactical fabric and body armor gone soft and dark with blood, and underneath it, the damage told its own story. Chest, side, both legs. A graze along his neck that had come close enough to something vital that I didn't want to think about how close. Entry wounds, exit wounds. Some rounds had passed clean through. Others were still buried somewhere inside him, waiting for me to go looking. I found the first one low in his shoulder, deep enough that my fingers had to work for it. I irrigated, clamped what needed clamping, packed what needed packing, and moved on before I let myself feel anything about what I'd just done. Suction. irrigate, extract, clamp, repeat. It became a rhythm, the only kind of prayer I know how to say. 5. A tech called out, meaning 5 rounds recovered, laid one at a time into a metal tray that was starting to sound less like triage and more like evidence. I didn't let the number distract me. I had a job in front of me, a body that was trying to decide whether to keep living, and my hands were the only argument I had for yes. My scrubs stuck to my back with sweat. My shoulders ached in a way I knew I'd feel tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow where any of this made sense. 12. The tech called, somewhere past the point where my arms had started to feel like they belonged to someone else. That was when his heart lost its rhythm entirely, the monitor shrieking a warning that didn't need translating. I called for the paddles before anyone else in the room could freeze. Clear, I said, and his body jerked once under the shock. The monitor stumbled, then caught, thin but steady again. Somewhere behind me, near the wall, I was aware of the taller officer standing very still, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear exactly, not calm either. Something in between. The look of a man recalculating what he thought he knew about who was allowed to save a life. It was somewhere past the 20th round, my fingers deep in tissue that no textbook fully prepares you for, that his hand shot up off the table and closed around my wrist, a grip far stronger than anything a man in his condition should have had left in him. It lasted only a second before his arm dropped again, unconscious once more. I didn't have time to think about what that meant, whether it was reflex or something trained so deep into him that even dying couldn't shake it loose. I filed it away, the way you file away anything you don't have the luxury to think about yet, and kept moving. Talk to me, I said, to no one and everyone, needing the sound of my own voice to keep my hands steady. Vitals climbing, the tech said. BP's coming up, 20 rounds out. Good, I said. We're not done. We weren't. Not close. I still had wounds in the worst place a body can carry them, low in the abdomen, where one wrong pass of my hand could turn a save into a funeral. I flexed my fingers once, feeling the ache settle deep into the joints, and looked at the tray beside me, already heavier than I wanted to count. 40 rounds. That was the number the soldier at the wall had given me before any of this started. 20 down meant 20 more still buried somewhere inside him, and I hadn't even reached the worst of it yet. Somewhere behind that unreadable look on the officer's face, I understood, without him saying another word, that whatever came out of this man tonight was not something that was going to stay quiet in this room. I picked up the next clamp and went back in. The next round came out of his lower side, and I didn't let myself think about the fact that my hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the kind of fatigue that settles into your joints when you've been standing over a body for the better part of an hour with no room for a mistake. 22, the tech called, dropping another round into the tray. It clinked against the others, a sound that had started to feel less like progress and more like a countdown I couldn't read the end of. I moved to his chest next, where a round had lodged close enough to a rib that I had to work slow, feeling for it the way you feel for something in the dark when you already know it's sharp. I irrigated. I clamped what needed clamping. I packed the wound and kept my eyes on his monitor instead of his face, because his face was the kind of thing that could make you hesitate, and hesitation was the one thing I couldn't afford. He coded again around the 26th round, his heart collapsing into a wild, useless quiver that the monitor screamed about before I even looked up. I called it before anyone else could freeze. Charge, I said, and I didn't wait for permission before I had the paddles in my hands. Clear. His body jerked once under the shock. The monitor stuttered, then found its rhythm again. Thin, but there. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone exhale, like they'd been holding this since the SUV pulled into the bay. 26, the tech said, and her voice had changed. It wasn't nervous anymore. It was following me now, the way the rest of the team had started to, falling into whatever rhythm I set instead of second-guessing it. I kept going. 30 rounds. The tray beside me heavier than any tray should be, each one a small, ugly piece of what this man had walked through before he ever reached my table. I didn't ask what kind of ambush leaves a body with this many holes in it. I didn't have the room in my head for that question. I had a job, And the job was simple in the way that only the most impossible jobs are simple. Keep him breathing until there's nothing left to remove. BP's coming up, the tech said. He's stabilizing. Good, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We're not done. We weren't. The last 10 rounds were buried in his abdomen, and that was the part of this whole night I'd been dreading since I made the decision to walk into this without a surgeon's sign-off. One wrong pass in that territory and I wasn't pulling a man back from the edge. I was pushing him over it myself. I took a breath, the kind you take right before you do something you can't undo, and I went in. My fingers were slick, and my shoulders had passed the point of aching into something closer to numb, but my focus held. Suction, irrigate, find it, extract. I found the deepest one lodged close enough to something vital that I had to slow my hands down to a pace that felt almost cruel, given how little time we'd had all night. I got it. I moved to the next. Somewhere in that stretch, the man on the table groaned, low and involuntary, the first sound he'd made since he arrived. It wasn't consciousness. It was just a body remembering it was still fighting. I took it as a good sign anyway. 35, the tech called, and I didn't slow down, because 5 more sat between me and the end of this. 40. The last round came out clean, and I set it into the tray with a hand that finally let itself shake. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't heard all night. Not the tense quiet of waiting for something to go wrong, but the strange, disbelieving quiet of watching something go right. His chest rose. It fell. It rose again, steady this time, the kind of steady that made my own breath catch in a way I hadn't let it since the SUV first came through the doors. Someone near the wall let out a shaky laugh that wasn't really a laugh. One of the younger nurses had tears on her face and didn't seem to notice them. I stood there with my gloves soaked through, my whole body running on nothing but the fumes of adrenaline, and for the first time since the code came in, I let myself feel the weight of what had just happened. The officer who'd been standing near the wall the entire time stepped forward. He'd been quiet through all of it, watching with an expression I still couldn't fully read. But now, up close, I saw something in his face settle, like a decision he'd been holding on to had finally resolved itself. "You saved him," he said. His voice was low, almost like he didn't trust it to hold if he spoke any louder. I looked down at the man on the table, still unconscious, still alive. I nodded once, because I didn't trust my own voice much either. "I just did my job," I said. It wasn't the whole truth, and some part of me knew that, even as I said it, this hadn't been a job. Jobs came with sign-offs and clearance, and a surgeon whose name went on the chart instead of mine. What I'd just done had no paperwork behind it, no protocol, nothing but my own hands and my own certainty that waiting would have meant watching a man die on a table I could have saved him on. I peeled my gloves off one finger at a time, my hands raw and trembling now that there was nothing left to steady them for. The tray beside me held 40 small, blood-streaked reminders of exactly how close this had come, and exactly how far I'd gone to keep it from going the other way. The officer didn't say anything else. He just looked at me a moment longer, the way you look at someone when you're recalculating everything you thought you understood about the situation you walked into, and then he turned to check on the man on the table, murmuring something too low for me to catch. I didn't ask what he said. I had already started thinking about the shift report I'd have to file. The question someone was eventually going to ask about who authorized a field surgery with no attending physician present, and the fact that the answer to that question was going to be no one. No one had authorized it. I had simply decided it was going to happen, and it had. I told myself, as I walked out of that trauma bay with blood still drying on my scrubs, that the outcome would speak for itself. A man who would have died was alive. Surely that counted for something, in whatever accounting the hospital kept for nights like this one. I didn't yet know that somewhere above my head, in an office I'd never been inside, that accounting was already being done, and the number they were tallying wasn't the one written on the chart. It was the number of ways I had gone around every rule meant to protect the hospital, and by morning, someone was going to hand me the bill. The sun was too soft for how the rest of that morning turned out. I remember thinking that as I walked up the steps of Crestline Regional, my scrubs still carrying the ghost of the night before, dried at the cuffs where I hadn't had the sense or the energy to change. 4 hours of sleep, if I was being generous with the word sleep. My hands still ached from the clamps. My eyes felt dry in a way that had nothing to do with the light. I told myself I wasn't expecting applause. I wasn't that naive, not after 12 years in this building. But some small, stubborn part of me expected a nod, a word, someone to look at me in the hallway and say, "I heard what you did last night." Instead, I got silence, and silence from people I'd worked beside for over a decade was its own kind of language. The morning chatter that usually filled the ER corridor was gone the second I walked through it. Nurses I passed found reasons not to look at me. A tech near the supply closet glanced at the faint red staining near my collar, then looked away fast enough that I felt it more than I saw it. I told myself it was exhaustion making me read too much into an ordinary morning. I kept walking toward the break room anyway, because coffee felt like the only decision I had the energy to make. I didn't get that far. "Nurse Cole, please report to administration." Immediately. The PA system caught me halfway down the hall, and the voice reading it wasn't the usual clerk with her half-bored, half-friendly cadence. This voice was flat, clipped, the kind of flat that only comes from someone reading off a script they didn't write but were told to deliver exactly as written. I stood still for a second, coffee forgotten, and something cold moved up through my chest. I walked the length of that corridor slower than I needed to, past the bulletin board with its laminated poster about excellence in patient care, past the memorial plaque for a nurse who'd retired the year I started. My footsteps sounded too loud to me, though I doubt anyone else noticed them at all. The glass doors of administration were already open when I reached them, which told me they'd been waiting. Inside, 2 hospital security officers stood near the wall, arms loose at their sides. In that particular way, security stands when they've been told this is a formality, not a threat, even though everyone in the room understands it's both. An HR coordinator I recognized only vaguely sat at the conference table with a folder in front of her. And behind the table, arms crossed, stood Dr. Marcus Holloway, Chief of Staff, wearing an expression that I imagine he'd practiced in a mirror before ever walking down here. "Addison." He said my name, evenly, almost gently. "Please, have a seat." I didn't sit right away. "What's going on?" The HR coordinator cleared her throat and opened the folder like it was the only thing keeping her hands busy. "We conducted a review of last night's events. We've identified multiple violations of hospital protocol." I felt my jaw tighten. "Violations. Unauthorized surgical procedure," she read, not quite meeting my eyes. "Operating without attending oversight. Breach of liability containment." I looked at Holloway, waiting for him to say something that made this make sense. He didn't disappoint me on delivery. "At least, given the circumstances," he said, "we have no choice but to terminate your employment. Effective immediately." I felt the words land somewhere behind my ribs, the kind of hit that doesn't hurt right away because your body hasn't caught up to what just happened. "Terminate," I repeated, because I needed to hear myself say it to believe it. "I saved a man's life. You did what you believed was right." Holloway's voice softened, but only the way a recorded apology softens, technically gentler without being any less final. "But it placed this hospital in a precarious legal position. We're a civilian facility, Addison. We don't answer to the military. There were no signed consents, no waivers, no clearance. You want to talk to me about paperwork?" My voice cracked in a way I hated. "He was dying. I was the only one in that building who could help him." "And you did," Holloway admitted. "Like that concession cost him something. But that doesn't change the risk you created." Risk. Not the man breathing on that table. Not the 12 years I'd spent in this building learning exactly how to read a body in crisis. Just risk. Spoken like it was the only word in the room that mattered. The HR coordinator slid an envelope across the table without quite looking at me. "Your severance. 1 week's pay. We'll need your badge and any hospital property before you leave the building." One of the security officers stepped forward then, not aggressively, just present, The way you'd position yourself near someone you'd been told might be a problem, even if nothing about the last 12 years of my record suggested I ever had been. I stood slower than I meant to. My hands were steady enough for surgery 6 hours ago, but they weren't steady now as I unclipped my badge, the one I'd earned through the kind of nights most people never see the inside of. I set it on the table like I was laying something down that mattered more than plastic and a laminated photo, because it did. I turned to go. Holloway added one more thing before I reached the door, and I think he meant it as a kindness, which somehow made it land worse. "You're a talented nurse, Addison. This isn't personal." I stopped, just for a second. "It's not personal," I repeated back to him. "Then why does it feel like betrayal?" Nobody answered that. Nobody was going to. The security officers walked me out through halls. I knew better than my own apartment. Past doctors I'd assisted through 100 bad nights, past a young tech who'd cried with relief the first time I'd talked her through her first code. Some of them looked at me with something like sympathy. Most of them didn't look at all. By the time I reached the staff entrance, my face was burning in a way that had nothing to do with the Texas heat waiting for me outside. The door buzzed open. I stepped into a morning that was too bright for what had just happened to me, and I stood by my car for a long moment without moving, my hand still curled slightly like it remembered the shape of a badge that no longer belonged to me. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't look at it yet. I already knew, somehow, that whatever it said wasn't going to undo the last 20 minutes, and I needed a second before I let anyone else's version of sympathy in. I sat down behind the wheel, staring at a steering wheel I didn't have the strength yet to grip, and looked up at the building I'd walked into for 12 years, believing it was somewhere I belonged. It didn't look like that anymore. It looked like a place that had decided, in the space of one meeting, exactly how little 12 years was worth against one night it hadn't authorized. I hadn't cried yet. I told myself I wasn't going to. Not in this parking lot. Not where anyone from that building could see me through a window and mistake it for regret. But somewhere behind that decision, in an office I'd never once set foot in, I would learn later that something else had already been set into motion, something that had nothing to do with Crestline Regional and everything to do with the man I'd spent 40 minutes pulling back from the edge of his own death. I didn't know that yet. All I knew, sitting in that parking lot with my badge gone and my hands empty, was that doing the right thing had just cost me everything I'd spent 12 years building. The drive home from Crestline Regional took 18 minutes, and I don't remember most of it. What I remember is walking into my apartment and closing the door behind me so carefully it barely made a sound, as if noise itself was something I couldn't afford to make anymore. The apartment looked the way it always did, the counter I'd meant to replace for 2 years, the half-empty coffee cup from the morning before, still sitting where I'd left it, back when I still had somewhere to be. The pale walls that had always felt like mine now just felt like walls. I set my bag down slowly, and that was when I saw it, sitting exactly where I'd tossed it the moment I walked in. My badge, my photo staring up at me from under the plastic, the same tired smile I must have worn the day they took that picture, back when 12 years still felt like it was building towards something instead of being erased in one meeting. I sat down at the kitchen table without changing out of my scrubs. My hands rested in my lap, and for a long moment, I didn't move at all, like my body had decided it needed permission to keep going, and nobody in that building had given it to me. I could still feel the ghost of the clamps in my fingers, the particular weight of 40 rounds lifted one at a time out of a man I'd never even learned the name of. I had saved his life, and now I was sitting here with nothing to show for it but silence. I looked at my phone on the table. Nothing. No missed calls, no messages, not even a "how are you holding up" from anyone I'd worked 12 years worth of overnight shifts beside. The silence wasn't an accident. It was a decision, made by every single person who knew exactly what had happened in that trauma bay and chose not to say a word about it, because standing next to me now might mean standing against something bigger than either of us. I walked to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror, my brown skin dulled under the flat bathroom light. My eyes tired in a way sleep wasn't going to fix. Not guilt. I want to be clear about that, even now. What I felt wasn't guilt. It was doubt. The kind that creeps in when the whole system you've given your life to turns around and tells you that the thing you were most sure of was actually the thing that cost you everything. I slid down onto the bathroom floor, my back against the cool edge of the tub, knees pulled up like I was trying to take up less space in a world that had already decided I'd taken up too much. What if they were right? What if 12 years of trusting my own hands had finally led me to overstep in a way I couldn't walk back? I'd acted because nobody else could. Nobody else would. But the hospital didn't measure things in heartbeats. It measured them in signatures, in waivers, in the kind of paperwork I hadn't had 4 minutes to produce while a man bled out in front of me. My stomach was hollow by the time I noticed I hadn't eaten since before my shift started, and even then, the thought of food did nothing but turn my stomach further. I stayed on that floor longer than I meant to, and when I finally stood, it wasn't because I felt better. It was because the tile had gotten too cold to keep sitting on. The next morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of quiet that had started to feel less like peace and more like a verdict. My phone still sat untouched on the counter. No apology from Crestline Regional. No word at all, in fact, from the man I'd saved, whoever he was. I told myself it was possible he didn't even know my name, possible the military had moved him somewhere far from Houston within hours, the way I imagined they moved anyone whose survival mattered to people who didn't officially exist. Possible I was never meant to know what happened to him at all. But I remembered him. I remembered the sudden strength in his grip on my wrist, in the middle of that surgery, the weight of his pulse under my glove in that first minute, the exact moment his chest rose steady instead of shallow. That moment should have meant something to somebody besides me. Instead, it had cost me the only career I'd ever built. I stood at my window for a while, watching the street below go on exactly the way it always did. A woman walking her dog, 2 kids racing bikes down the sidewalk. None of them knew that behind this particular window, a nurse who'd given Crestline Regional 12 years of her life had just lost everything in the space of one 20-minute meeting, and the world outside hadn't so much as slowed down to notice. I picked my badge back up off the counter later that day, turning it over in my hands the way you turn over something you're not sure you're allowed to keep anymore. I thought about throwing it away. My fingers even closed around it hard enough to test the idea. But something in me wouldn't let go of it. Not yet, and I set it back down instead, gently, the way you'd rest a hand on a patient who was still breathing even if you couldn't be sure yet how long that would last. This isn't the end of it, I told myself, though I had no proof of that beyond the stubborn, quiet certainty sitting underneath all the shame and the silence. I knew what I had seen in that trauma bay. I knew what his vitals had done under my hands. That kind of knowing doesn't just go away because a chief of staff decided it was inconvenient. 3 more days passed like that, quiet and empty. The kind of quiet that stops feeling like healing and starts feeling like a sentence. I barely left the apartment. I barely looked at my phone. By the 4th morning, I'd stopped expecting it to say anything different. That was when it buzzed on the counter, breaking a silence I'd almost gotten used to. Then again, a second time. I looked down at the screen. An unknown number. No name attached. No explanation. I didn't answer it. Not yet. I just stood there, staring at the 2 missed calls sitting side by side on the screen, feeling something shift in my chest that I couldn't name. Some instinct built over 12 years of trauma call telling me that whatever this was, it wasn't finished with me yet. The second buzz on my phone had barely faded when a sound rolled in from somewhere outside that didn't belong to any car engine or lawnmower I knew. It was low at first, distant. The kind of thing you could mistake for weather if you weren't paying attention. But it didn't roll in waves the way thunder does. It beat, steady, rhythmic, growing louder by the second. I set my phone down and walked out onto the porch, still in the same old hoodie I'd been living in for 4 days. My legs stiff from too much sitting and not enough sleeping. The Houston sky above my street was pale, cloudless, the kind of ordinary morning I'd stopped trusting since the night everything changed. My neighbors were out doing what neighbors do. One man pushing a mower 2 doors down, a woman walking a dog on the corner, a couple of kids somewhere behind me arguing over a bike. None of it matched the sound growing overhead. Then I saw it. 1 helicopter, then a second behind it, both of them matte black against the pale sky, and they weren't passing over. They were coming down, right toward my apartment complex, low enough that the mower 2 doors down cut off mid-pass as the man staring up forgot what he was doing. My heart slammed hard enough that I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing before I dropped it. A dozen thoughts hit me at once, none of them good. I thought about the badge sitting on my counter, about whatever unauthorized violation I'd apparently committed being bigger than I understood, about men in uniforms showing up at your door for reasons that never turn out to be good news. Doors opened up and down my street as neighbors stepped out to watch, a few already filming with their phones raised, the wind kicking up hard enough to bend the trees along the sidewalk and set off somebody's car alarm 2 houses down. The first helicopter dropped into the parking lot of my complex, the second circling once before it settled behind it. Dust kicked up in a cloud around both of them. My hair whipped across my face, and I lifted an arm on instinct to shield my eyes from the wind rolling off the blades. The doors on the lead helicopter opened, and figures climbed down onto the pavement, boots landing heavy, uniforms dark and pressed, sunglasses hiding whatever expression they were wearing. But it was the man walking at the center of the group who held my attention, tall, composed, silver insignia catching the light at his collar. Even from this distance, his eyes found mine and stayed there as he started toward my porch. I didn't move. I couldn't have told you in that moment whether I was afraid or something closer to numb, but my feet stayed rooted to the same spot on my porch, even as the wind kept tearing at my hoodie and my neighbors kept whispering behind cupped hands. The commander stopped at the bottom of my porch steps and took off his sunglasses. His eyes were blue, direct, nothing hidden in them that I could read. "Addison Cole," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, because there was nothing else to say to a man who already knew exactly who I was. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform and pulled out a sealed white envelope, crisp at the edges, official in a way that made my stomach tighten. Then, before I could brace for whatever was inside it, he took a step back and saluted me. I stood there, unsure whether I was allowed to believe what I was seeing. "You saved one of ours," he said, his voice carrying clean over the wind. "We don't forget that." My throat closed around whatever I might have said back. My hands were shaking as I reached for the envelope he held out, and he kept his eyes on mine while I took it. "We tracked you down," he added, "because people like you don't belong in the shadows." Somewhere behind him, a few more neighbors had gathered, phones raised higher now, murmuring low to each other. I broke the seal on the envelope with fingers that didn't feel entirely like my own. Inside was a letter carrying an official Navy seal, formal and grateful in language I only half absorbed before my eyes landed on what was tucked beneath it. A check, $100,000. "I don't understand," I said, and I meant it. His expression softened, just slightly. "You acted without hesitation for a Tier 1 operator. 40 rounds, no surgeon, no backup, and you didn't wait for anyone's permission to save him. We've debriefed him. He remembers everything, including whose hands pulled him back." He paused. "You didn't know his name, but you gave him a future. And now we'd like to give you something back." One of the other officers stepped forward carrying a small velvet box, and when he opened it, the metal inside caught the sunlight, an eagle stamped into silver, the words "Civilian Valor" engraved beneath it. Fewer than 50 of these, the commander told me, had ever been awarded. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely holding steady. "Because you did what no one else in that building could do," he said, "and you did it for the right reason." I took the medal in both hands. It was heavier than it looked, and it didn't feel like a burden the way I might have expected. It felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to after 4 days of feeling like the ground under me had disappeared entirely. Behind me, someone on the block started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the whole street had joined in, cheering from porches and driveways while the helicopters idled behind the commander, blades still turning, dust still swirling around all of us. I hadn't been arrested. I hadn't been reprimanded. I'd been found and honored in front of the same neighbors who'd watched me disappear into my apartment 4 days ago without a single word to any of them about why. I let the tears come then, because there was no reason left to hold them back. 4 days of silence, of wondering whether doing the right thing had been worth losing everything, and here was my answer, delivered by 2 helicopters and a man who had flown in just to salute me on my own front porch. I stepped forward and extended my hand. The commander shook it firmly. "Thank you," I said, my voice raw in a way I didn't try to hide. "No," he said. "Thank you." Then, as quickly as they'd landed, the officers turned back toward their aircraft. The engines roared to life again, the wind kicking up one last time hard enough to bend the trees along my street, and I stood on my porch with the medal in one hand and the envelope in the other, watching the helicopters lift off and shrink into the pale morning sky. My neighbors lingered, some of them still filming, most of them just standing there in the kind of stunned quiet that follows something nobody quite has words for yet. I stayed on the porch long after the sound of the blades had faded completely, feeling something in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel in 4 days. It wasn't relief exactly. It was closer to permission, the sense that whatever silence Crestline Regional had wrapped around me, it wasn't the only voice that got to decide what my 12 years had been worth. I didn't know yet that the video already circulating on somebody's phone from up the street was about to make sure the whole country heard about it too. The video was already everywhere by the time I checked my phone again. A neighbor 3 doors down had posted 12 seconds of the helicopter's landing, my hand shaking as I took the envelope, my knees nearly giving out under the salute. 2 million views within half a day, the caption under it doing more talking than I ever could have. By evening, a Houston station had picked it up. By the next morning, it wasn't just Houston anymore. I sat at my kitchen table watching my phone light up with names I recognized from national news and plenty I didn't. Producers and bookers and reporters all asking for 5 minutes of my time, and I didn't answer most of them. It wasn't that I didn't know what to say. It was that none of it felt like something I'd agreed to be a part of. I hadn't chased any of this. I'd just done what I was trained to do on a night when nobody else could. 2 days after the helicopters, a woman from the Navy's Public Affairs Office called to ask if I'd be willing to attend a small ceremony. Small, she called it, though when I arrived at the auditorium downtown, small wasn't the word I would have used. 100 folding chairs, a stage with a podium and an American flag on one side, the Navy's seal on the other. Cameras lined up at the back of the room like a wall of black eyes. I sat in the front row in a plain Navy dress. No makeup, hair pulled back the same way I wore it on shift, because I hadn't come here to be someone I wasn't. My hands stayed laced together in my lap, my nerves humming under my skin in a way I hadn't felt since the night the SUV came through the doors. A Navy public relations officer stepped up to the podium first, flanked by the flag and the seal, and started talking before I was fully ready to hear my own name said out loud in front of a room full of strangers. Today we honor a civilian who exemplified extraordinary courage in a moment of unspeakable pressure, he said. A nurse who saved the life of one of our own. He paused, letting that settle over the room. A Tier 1 operator, whose identity, for national security reasons, remains classified, is alive today because Addison Cole chose to act. She operated alone, without orders, without backup, and under the threat of professional and legal consequences. He looked at me directly then. But sometimes doing what's right isn't about permission, it's about character. He announced the medal by its full name, the highest honor the Navy gives to a civilian, and the room came up out of their chairs in applause loud enough that I felt it in my chest before I fully processed what it meant. I stood, my legs less steady than I would have liked, and walked toward the stage. The same commander from my porch stood waiting at the center, and when I reached him, he placed the medal around my neck himself, its weight familiar now, catching the stage lights the same way it had caught the Texas sun 4 days earlier. He leaned in close enough that only I could hear him. "You were the only line between death and life," he said. "Don't ever forget that." I didn't trust my voice enough to answer him. A second officer handed me a microphone, and for a moment I just stood there, the room holding its breath along with me. No script in my hand, no idea what I was going to say until I started saying it. "I don't know what to say," I began, my voice unsteady in a way I didn't try to hide. I didn't plan any of this. I didn't wake up that morning thinking I'd end up standing here. The room quieted further, even the cameras in the back seeming to lower a fraction. I'm a nurse. I've spent 12 years training for moments like that one. Not for attention, not for danger, for the chance to help somebody when nobody else can. That's what I did. I looked down at the medal resting against my chest before I kept going. When his life was hanging in the balance, I chose to act. Not because I'm brave, not because I'm special, because someone had to, and no one else would. My fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. And maybe I lost a lot because of that choice. My job, my reputation, my peace, for a few days. But if I had to do it again, I would, every time, because that man is alive. He's breathing. He'll see his family again, and that's worth it. A single tear slid down my cheek before I could stop it. I want to thank the Navy for seeing me, for believing what happened in that trauma bay when the people I worked beside for 12 years chose not to. I let that land, not as an accusation, just as a fact I needed to say out loud once. I don't need to be famous. I don't need more medals. I just need to know I made a difference, that I mattered. I stepped back from the microphone, and the room came apart in applause that went on longer than I expected. People standing without seeming to notice they'd done it. Reporters at the back typing fast, a few faces in the crowd openly crying. I stood there absorbing it the way you absorb air after being underwater longer than you meant to be. By the time I made it home that night, my name was trending under half a dozen different hashtags I didn't fully understand. My speech already clipped and shared and argued over by people I'd never met. Nurses from other cities were posting about their own unpaid overtime, their own moments of stepping in when the system asked them not to. Legal commentators were calling Crestline Regional's decision a cautionary tale. A national hospital chain reached out within the week, offering me a position that didn't yet exist anywhere but on paper. Something about emergency ethics and advocacy. My name already attached to the title before I'd said a word. I didn't accept it right away. I wasn't chasing redemption. Because somewhere underneath all the noise, I'd started to understand I never needed it in the first place. The world had just taken its time, catching up to what I already knew to be true the night I picked up that first clamp. That night, I sat with a cup of tea and watched the ceremony replay on my phone, my own voice sounding steadier to me now than it had felt standing at that podium. The camera held on my face at the end, the medal catching the light, and underneath it, a headline that finally said what I'd known all along, even through 4 days of silence, nobody else had been willing to break. I didn't know yet where that offer for Denver was going to lead, or how far it would take me from the only city I'd ever called home. I just knew, watching myself on that small screen, that I wasn't going back to being the version of myself who waited quietly in a parking lot for someone else to decide what her 12 years had been worth. The flight into Denver landed under a sky so clear it almost didn't look real after a week of Houston humidity and camera flashes. My breath fogged in front of me the second I stepped off the plane. 2 suitcases rolling behind me and that Navy letter still folded into the inside pocket of my coat, close enough to my chest that I could feel the shape of it if I pressed my palm flat against my ribs. It had been exactly 1 week since the helicopters landed on my street. 1 week since the world decided, almost overnight, that I was somebody worth calling a hero. But standing on that tarmac, the mountains sitting pale and distant against the skyline, none of that noise followed me off the plane. I hadn't come here to be praised. I'd come here to start over. And for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, starting over didn't feel like something being done to me. It felt like something I was choosing. Alpine Crest Medical Center wasn't the biggest building I'd ever walked into. It didn't have the sprawling glass towers Crestline Regional had spent a fortune on, but it stood clean and solid beneath the snow-dusted peaks in the distance, its entrance catching the morning light in a way that made the whole place look like it meant what it was doing. I didn't feel nerves walking toward those doors. I felt something steadier than that, something closer to purpose, settling into my chest for the first time in weeks. Inside, the lobby held the low hum of a hospital already moving through its morning, the particular rhythm I'd know blindfolded after 12 years of mornings just like it. A young receptionist looked up as I approached the desk, her eyes going wide before she'd even finished standing. "You must be Miss Cole," she said. They've been expecting you. I gave her a small smile, still not entirely used to being expected anywhere. Every moment since those helicopters had felt like it belonged to somebody else's story, somebody braver or luckier than the version of myself who'd been sitting on a bathroom floor 4 days after losing everything. But this moment, walking into a building that had chosen to trust me before I'd proven anything to them at all, felt more real than any of it. They walked me through wide, clean corridors, nurses offering small nods as I passed, a few murmuring my name to each other, none of it with the cold silence I'd learned to expect from hallways back home. I didn't need anyone to make a show of welcoming me. The quiet respect following me down that hallway did more than applause ever could have. My new office sat at the far end of the emergency wing, and when I reached it, my name was already up on the glass in soft silver letters. Addison Cole, Chief of Emergency Response. I ran my fingers over the lettering for a moment, letting it settle into something real. Inside, a desk waited along with a new coat draped over the chair, a shelf lined with books I hadn't read yet, and a note from the staff propped against the desk lamp. "We're proud to work with you," it read. Nothing more elaborate than that. And somehow, that was exactly enough. I didn't spend that first day behind the desk. I walked the floor instead, the way I always had, checking in on patients, shadowing triage long enough to learn the rhythm of a department that wasn't mine yet, but was already starting to feel like it could be. I knelt beside a boy running a fever while his father paced near the curtain, and I told the father the same thing I would have told any father back in Houston, that his son was going to be fine, that we had him now. I took notes. I listened. Nobody here needed a headline to trust that I knew what I was doing. By the time the sun started sinking behind the mountains that evening, I stood outside the entrance in my coat, my breath rising into air that felt sharper and cleaner than anything Houston had ever offered me. Behind me, Alpine Crest kept moving the way hospitals do, lit up against the dusk, full of people who had looked at everything that happened to me in the last 2 weeks and decided it made me someone worth building a place for, not someone to be quietly pushed out a back door. I looked up at the first stars breaking through the darkening sky and let myself feel, just for a moment, something I hadn't let myself feel since before that Tuesday night shift back in Houston. Not vindication exactly. Something quieter than that. The sense that I hadn't just found a new job 3 states away from everything I used to know. I'd walked through a door that had been built for me by people who'd never once asked me to explain myself, and for the first time, since I'd unclipped that badge and set it on a conference table like a funeral offering, I let myself believe I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be. I didn't know yet that in a few months, I'd be standing at the gates of a very different building, waiting to see the one person whose survival had started all of this in the first place. Months had passed by the time I found myself standing outside a recovery center on a Navy base I'd never set foot on before, the kind of quiet, a sun-washed afternoon that made it hard to believe how loud my life had gotten since that Tuesday night in Houston. Denver had settled into something steady under me by then, the kind of steady I hadn't let myself hope for back when I was sitting on my bathroom floor with a badge I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I'd been invited out here through channels I still didn't fully understand. A call from someone at the Navy who simply told me he was healing well and had asked whether I'd be willing to visit. No press, no ceremony. Just a conversation between 2 people who'd shared something neither of us had asked for. I said yes before I'd even finished hearing the question. The room they led me to was simple. A single bed. A window that looked out over a training field where I could see figures moving in formation somewhere in the distance. The man in the bed looked nothing like the version of him I carried in my memory, pale and slack and fighting for every breath. He was stronger now, color back in his face, though the scars still ran visible along his shoulder and down one forearm where I remembered my hands working fastest. He looked up when I stepped in, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. Some silences don't need filling. "They told me your name," he said finally, a faint smile pulling at one corner of his mouth. "Addison." "They told me yours," I said. "Not all of it, though." He let out a short laugh at that, the kind that comes easier once the worst of something is behind you. "No cameras?" he asked. "No microphones," I said. "Just us." I pulled a chair up near the bed and we talked for a while in low, unhurried voices, the kind of conversation that doesn't need an audience to matter. He told me pieces of that night from his side. The ambush, the moment he thought it was over for good. I told him about the 26th round, the way his vitals had climbed just enough to keep me going when I wasn't sure I had anything left in my hands. It wasn't a story either of us was interested in handing over to a reporter. It belonged to the two of us, and to nobody else. "I owe you more than my life," he said eventually, quiet in a way that made the words land harder than if he'd said them loud. I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything. I meant it. You gave me something too. The reason I became a nurse in the first place. I'd started to forget it before that night." He studied me for a moment, the way people do when they're about to ask something they're not sure they're allowed to. "Where'd you learn to work like that?" he said. "Nobody teaches civilian ER nurses to run a field surgery like you ran one." I hadn't said this out loud in years. Not once. Not to anyone at Crestline Regional in 12 years of shifts. "I served," I said. "Navy Nurse Corps, trauma rotations, before any of this. I left it behind a long time ago and never told anyone back home. Figured that part of me was done." Something shifted in his face. Recognition rather than surprise. "Guess it wasn't as done as you thought." "No," I said. "I guess it wasn't." We sat with that for a moment, and when I stood to leave, he reached out and shook my hand, firm and steady. No salute this time. Nothing performed about it. Just two people who understood exactly what the other had survived. Outside, the afternoon light was warm and low, flags along the base fluttering in a breeze that had picked up while I was inside. I walked slowly toward the gates, my steps lighter than they'd felt in months. The weight I'd carried out of Crestline Regional finally starting to feel like something I'd set down for good. "Miss Cole?" I turned to find a young woman standing a short distance away, barely into her 20s by the look of her, dressed in crisp nursing whites, a badge still fresh enough to catch the light. She held a notepad against her chest, like she wasn't quite sure she was allowed to approach me. "I just wanted to say," she started, a little too fast, like she'd rehearsed it and lost her place anyway. "You're the reason I went into nursing. I read everything, watched the interviews. You made me believe we could still make a difference out here." I felt something settle warmly behind my ribs, a kind of quiet I hadn't expected from a stranger's words. I stepped forward and rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "Promise me something," I said. "Never wait for permission to do what's right." She nodded, her eyes bright, holding on to that the way you hold on to something you intend to keep for a long time. Behind us both, I heard the low hum of rotors starting up somewhere across the base. Two helicopters lifting off in the distance, not rushing anywhere this time, just rising steady into the afternoon sky like they had nowhere urgent left to be. I turned back toward the gates and the road waiting beyond them, and for the first time since that Tuesday night shift that started all of this, I didn't feel like someone who had lost everything trying to find her footing again. I felt like someone who already had. The road away from the base ran straight through open country, and I kept the window cracked the whole drive back into Denver, letting the cold air cut through the warmth still sitting in my chest from that conversation, from the young woman's promise still holding in her eyes. Some days end exactly the way they need to, and that one had, clean and whole in a way I hadn't expected when I first stepped through those gates that morning. Alpine Crest was waiting for me the way it always did now, steady and familiar under the mountain light, no longer a place I was still getting used to, but one that had simply become mine. I walked the emergency floor that evening, the way I had every evening since Denver, checking charts, trading a few quiet words with the night shift, my name still sitting in soft silver letters on the glass at the end of the hall. No longer strange to look at. It was there, standing at the nurse's station a few weeks later, that I finally let myself think all the way through what the last several months had actually cost me and given me in equal measure. Crestline Regional had never called. Dr. Holloway had never reached out, not with an apology, not with an explanation beyond the one he'd already given me across that conference table. I understood by then that he never would. Some decisions don't get reversed. They just get outlived by better ones made somewhere else. And that was going to have to be enough, because it was all I was ever going to get from that building. I still had the envelope from that first morning on my porch. The letter from the Navy folded now inside a drawer in my new office instead of my coat pocket, close enough to reach whenever I needed, reminding of what 12 years of instinct had turned out to be worth in someone else's eyes, even after it hadn't been worth anything in Crestline Regionals. The check had gone toward things I never imagined. I'd have the room to think about a few months earlier, a little more breathing space, a fund set aside for whatever came next. The medals sat in a small case on a shelf in my apartment, not hidden, not displayed like trophies either. Just there, the way anything true eventually settles into a life instead of hanging over it. My old badge from Crestline Regional stayed in that drawer too, tucked beside the Navy letter instead of thrown away. I hadn't been able to part with it the night I lost my job, and I still couldn't now. Not because I missed who I'd been in that building, but because it reminded me I'd never needed anyone's permission to be exactly that nurse, badge, or no badge. Long before the Navy ever showed up on my porch to say so. I thought about the soldier sometimes, not with the ache of unfinished business, but with something calmer, something closer to peace. I didn't need to know more than I already did. I'd sat with him once, without cameras, and that had been enough for both of us to close whatever had opened between us the night I pulled 40 rounds out of his body. Some things don't need a sequel. They just need to be true once, clearly, and then allowed to rest. And the young woman from the base, the one who'd stood there clutching her notepad like it might keep her steady, I thought about her too, more often than I expected to. I didn't know her name, hadn't asked for it, but I knew what she was carrying now. The same promise I'd made her say back to herself before I let her go. Never wait for permission to do what's right. I hoped she'd hold on to that longer than 4 days of silence could shake loose, longer than any hospital's version of risk management could talk her out of. There were still nights at Alpine Crest that tested me the way nights always test people who choose this work. Codes that came in fast and ugly, decisions that had to be made before there was time to ask anyone's permission for them. I made those calls the same way I always had, the same way I had that Tuesday night in Houston, trusting 12 years of hands that had learned long before this job ever tried to tell me otherwise. I wasn't the same nurse who'd walked into Crestline Regional that final morning, expecting a word of thanks and getting a locked door instead. I'd lost that version of myself somewhere in the 4 days of silence that followed, and I didn't especially miss her. She'd waited for permission her whole career. I didn't anymore. Some evenings I still stood outside Alpine Crest the way I had that first day, watching the light drop behind the mountains, feeling something in my chest that had nothing left in it to prove. I hadn't set out to become anybody's symbol. I'd only ever wanted to be someone who showed up when it mattered. And somewhere between that trauma bay and this quiet mountain hospital, I'd finally landed in a place that let me be exactly that without asking me to apologize for it first. I didn't need the world to keep talking about what happened that Tuesday night. I only needed to know, standing here now, that when it mattered most, I hadn't waited, and I never would again.